I appreciate everyone coming and joining us today. I'm Neeta Thakur. I'm at the University of California, San Francisco, and one of the members of the HEI Research Committee. I'm joined here by Dr. Gehring, who's on our HEI Review Committee, and we'll be both introducing the speakers and moderating our discussion today. I welcome everyone. We're going to have a great conversation of thinking about not just air pollution, but cumulative exposures and how they impact the developing brain and contribute to different neurological outcomes and mental health over the lifespan. And to start us off, we have Dr. Patrick Ryan, who will be giving our first talk, who is a professor of pediatrics and environmental and Public Health Sciences at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center at the University of Cincinnati at the College of Medicine. He obtained his Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics from Xavier University and his master's and his PhD degrees in Epi from University of Cincinnati. He currently serves as the Associate Director for Research in the Division of Biostatistics and Epidemiology, the Director of the Graduate Program in Clinical and Translational Research, and the Director of the Translational Workforce Development Corps for the Center for Clinical and Translational Sciences and Training. His research integrates exposure science with epidemiology to study the impact of environmental exposures and social determinants of health, including air pollution, community resources, temperature, green space, and others, on respiratory and neurodevelopment health outcomes in both children and adults. In addition, his research includes the use of wearable devices and low-cost environmental sensors in epidemiological studies. Before we welcome him here, I just want to let you all know we'll be doing a panel discussion at the end, so jot down all of your questions, and we are looking forward to a rich discussion.
It's on this. All right, no, good. Well, thank you. Thanks for the the invitation, the opportunity to be here today. And I'm really happy to kick off this session that's focusing on environmental exposures and childhood mental health outcomes. So what I'd like to do is try to set the stage and talk a little bit about the burden of mental health disorders in kids, talk about what we know influences those outcomes from a social and environmental determinants of health perspective, take a quick look at environmental exposures, touch upon pathways and mechanisms that might lead to mental health outcomes, talk about brain development and why kids and adolescents are particularly at risk for environmental exposures when it comes to these types of outcomes, and then finally share with you just a touch of research that we've done in Cincinnati looking at air pollution and mental health outcomes in kids. So you probably know that mental health is a crisis in the United States. In fact, at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, we just opened an entire inpatient facility to deal with mental health and behavioral problems in kids. You can see here the prevalence of various mental health outcomes, anxiety and depression, behavior and conduct disorders that affect up to 1 in 5 kids in the United States. And the consequences of these anxiety and depression, these mental health disorders go beyond the disease itself, but to affect all sorts of other things like school performance. Kids with mental health, anxiety and depression disorders are more likely to abuse substances, to have encounters with the justice system, criminality, and economic consequences as well. So lifelong unemployment is one outcome associated with anxiety and depression. And I'd also point out that now suicide is the second leading cause of death in children and young adults ages 10 to 24 in the United States. So, and beyond that, the things that we're talking about, the data I'm showing here, the prevalence of anxiety and depression are these clinical outcomes, these clinical thresholds that someone comes in and someone diagnoses a child or young adult with these. But really, you can think of these disorders as a spectrum. And some of the research that we do, we measure the continuum of anxiety or depression, for example, using validated assessments. And so the burden of these disorders that might not even reach the clinical threshold is likely greater than the numbers that you see here. The other bit of background that I wanted to point out is the age of onset of these disorders. So I'm showing just anxiety and depression. You can see anxiety typically has an onset in younger children, younger childhood, starting around age 4 and reaching, about 100% cumulative incidence by the time they exit the teenage years. Whereas depression has this later onset, starting generally in young adolescents, ages 10, 12, and then having that increase through adolescence, through the high school years, into 18 to 20 or so. So earlier onset for anxiety, later onset for depression. And I asked one of my colleagues and friends, Jeff Strawn, is a psychiatrist at the University of Cincinnati, who is an expert in anxiety and depression in kids. And I asked him, could you share with me a slide from your perspective? What are some of the risk factors that you think about as a clinician when it comes to anxiety and depression? And this is what he sent me. And I really like it because it focuses on a lot of the traditional risk factors that clinicians and counselors think about when it comes to anxiety and depression. So things like stressful life events or parenting factors, negative peer interactions, behavioral inhibitions. When it comes to depression, again, a little later age of onset, but things like chronic physical illnesses, anxiety is a risk factor for the development of depression in later childhood, early adversities, parents' depression, things like that that lead to depression outcomes in young adults. The other thing I'd like to point out is the genetic contribution to these disorders. Typically, the studies are showing about 25 to 60%, with most of the studies around 30 to 40%, as the genetic contribution to these anxiety and depression disorders. So a large proportion come from external non-genetic factors. So turning our attention a little bit to social determinants of mental health. And I think everyone's well aware of these conditions that are defined as, the conditions in which people born, work, grow, live, and age. That shape the development of multiple health outcomes throughout childhood. And this is a significant predictor or contributor to multiple outcomes like asthma, cardiovascular disease, and mental health is certainly not immune to these as well. And so if we think about genetics contributing about 30 to 40%, a lot of the non-genetic factors that fall under this umbrella of social determinants of health again, fall into those risk factors at an individual and also as a wider social contribution. So things, again, like early life and childhood adversity, nutrition, adverse child experiences, witnessing violence early in life as an adverse child experience is an example of one of those that is a risk factor for developing anxiety and depression. But also social capital, also neighborhoods. So children who live in neighborhoods with lower resources and higher levels of poverty are more likely to have anxiety and depression, and the physical environment. And I really like this tweet. It's 10 years old now from Francis Collins. But he was retweeting from someone else, and it says, if DNA is our biological blueprint, ZNA, or their zip-coded birth, is the blueprint for our behavioral and psychosocial makeup. So I like that because it's starting to consider, beyond the genetic contributors, but really the broader social determinants of health that lead to behavioral and psychosocial outcomes. The other thing I'd like to point out, and we're going to talk about in this session, is that these exposures, these external factors, don't occur in isolation. So this is a figure from a recent paper talking about the cumulative impacts of social determinants of health as the totality of exposures, the combinations of all these things. And I think it's important as an environmental epidemiologist, I fall into the trap of often thinking about, air pollution and exposure, and then we might adjust for a couple of things that we think might be important or look at some effect modification. But really, it's important to think about environmental exposures are occurring in the context of a lot of other things. So the housing that the children are living in, the green space that they have, the neighborhood resources, the access to care. And it's important to at least conceptualize that these all happen together. So we're thinking about environmental exposures and the context in which they occur. So turning a little bit now to environmental exposures that have been linked to mental health. This is a figure from a recent review that looks at all sorts of environmental exposures. in both animal studies and epidemiologic studies. This is the figure from the human studies side of things, looking at all sorts of environmental exposures, potential pathways that lead to various outcomes, including here depression and behavior and anxiety and schizophrenia. But you can see there's been a number of environmental exposures. I think metals are probably one of the more widely recognized neurotoxins, especially things like lead and manganese and arsenic and mercury and maybe fluoride. And so these metals are certainly been widely studied more in the context of cognitive outcomes and behavioral outcomes, but also seem to play a role in some of these other outcomes like depression and anxiety. Solvents, phthalates, PCBs, pesticides, temperature. So increased temperature seems to be associated with externalizing behaviors. I think we probably all feel that when it gets hot outside, your stress response gets a little thrown off. Green space is an interesting exposure. Typically thought of as perhaps a modifier of air quality or decreasing stress levels or increasing social integration, but certainly in our studies and others have been associated with higher green space near the homes of children, decreasing the risk for things like depression. And then air pollution. So we're here at HEI, and a lot of obviously what we focus on is air pollution exposure. And I think over the last 15 plus years, there's been increasing recognition that air pollutants can be toxic to the central nervous system. Typically, the studies looking at PM 2.5 and probably ultrafine particles, although there's been less epidemiologic data to support the ultrafine particle fraction of that. Mechanisms are both direct and indirect. Direct mechanisms being particles directly being exposed to the brain through the olfactory bulb or crossing the blood-brain barrier, but also indirect mechanisms where inflammation in the peripheral organs in the body leading to an inflammatory response, a neuroinflammatory response in the brain, or perhaps disruption of the HPA axis, which is a pathway that's been seen from air pollution exposure leading to things like asthma as well. And then what we're going to talk about in just a second, when exposure to neurotoxics occur during periods of brain maturation, those disruptions can then show up later on in life. And I think, again, lead is a classic example of this, where you have lead exposure in early childhood being tied to criminality that occurs in the 20s and 30s. So this is a figure that I pulled from a paper that's been published 10 plus years ago now, but laying out various neuropsychological developmental outcomes. And I've added here in my thoughts in the red arrows on where the literature is in general. So dealing with air pollution exposure and neuro outcomes. And I would say that there's been quite a bit now of epidemiologic data showing increased air pollution exposure associated with reduced fine motor abilities, gross motor abilities, a lot in the cognition outcomes. So a lot of studies looking at air pollution exposure being associated with reduced IQ, worse executive function, so worse decision making. When you're looking at clinical outcomes, I think it was mentioned before in a session I was at, autism is an outcome that's been linked with air pollution exposure, as well as things like ADHD. So clinical diagnoses of some of these things. In the circle is where we're focusing on in this session, and where a lot of the work that we're doing is focusing on. And here they call it social and emotional outcomes. I tend to call it mental health outcomes. But again, these are more the internalizing disorders. So depression and anxiety, they're a little bit tougher to measure. So how we assess those in our studies are a little bit different than externalizing disorders, which are a little bit easier to observe and capture in studies. So let's talk just very briefly about why children and why young adults. This is a classic figure showing neuronal development in the first 2 years of life. And you can see this is a period of rapid growth and connectivity. The neurons are being formed, the connections are being formed, and there's actually a period of pruning where they actually are being pruned and the connections are being more efficient. So this period of neuronal development that's occurring prenatally and in early childhood, as well as growth and development of gray matter and white matter. So brain cells and the brain connections between the cells. You really see these timing where the volume is increasing mid-gestation through the first few years of life into adolescence for some areas of the brain and some types of brain cells. And then when it comes to white matter, this rapid increase that continues through childhood into the 30s, and then you see this period of decline in later adults. And so that's where you see another body of literature looking at how air pollution and environmental exposures affect the rate of decline later in life, because there's also that period of brain changes that are going on in later adulthood. And the other time period that I'd like to point out that we do a lot of our work with is adolescence. So if you have adolescence, you know that this is a period of changes and maybe bad decisions and other things. But this, some of that is because the brain is actually undergoing changes. So there's changes in the prefrontal cortex and the myelination and the pruning. There's this loss of gray matter that increases the efficiency of the brain. And there's also this limbic system activity that's increasing as well. So this is a period of things like fear extinction. So there are paradigms where people are looking at air pollution exposure and how that affects the brain's ability to extinguish fear appropriately. And so those are the types of changes that are occurring in adolescence, where we're thinking that maybe environmental exposures that occur during this time period are particularly harmful, as well as the early childhood period. So I want to share a little bit of the work that we're doing in Cincinnati. Much of this comes out of a birth cohort that we've had now for more than 2 decades, called the Cincinnati Childhood Allergy and Air Pollution Study, or the CAPS cohort. So the original objective of this cohort was to look at children who are exposed to traffic-related air pollution and the risk of developing allergic diseases and asthma. But since these kids were about 7 years old, we started to look at neurodevelopmental outcomes as well. And so you can see here, we've been following these kids with clinic visits at 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 12, 14 to 17, and we're actually seeing them currently in their early 20s. And we've done lots of assessments, obviously, for allergic disease and asthma, but also for neurodevelopmental outcomes, again, starting when they were 7 years old, and including at age 12, starting with MRIs and a large neurodevelopmental battery, which we're continuing now in their early 20s. And so here's some of the results that we've seen. This is an analysis looking at early childhood exposure to traffic-related air pollution through the first 6 months of life, cumulatively through childhood, and in the 12 months prior to the 12-year visit when they came in. And the outcome here is child-reported depression and anxiety with validated assessments, with the child-reported depression scale, the CDI, and the SPENS, the SCAS scale. And so what we saw was early childhood exposure to traffic-related air pollution being significantly associated with increased symptoms of both depression at age 12, as well as total anxiety, generalized anxiety, and social phobias at age 12. When we look at some of the MRI data, we see structural changes associated with air pollution exposure. This is a paper where we are looking at cortical thickness and gray matter volume, and seeing both were associated with increased exposure to traffic-related air pollution in the first year of life. So reduced cortical thickness and reduced gray matter volume associated with air pollution exposure in the first year of our kid's life. And then looking at brain metabolism as a pathway that might be leading from air pollution exposure to our anxiety outcomes. This is spectroscopy data where we're looking at brain metabolite levels at, in this case, at age 12. And we looked at metabolites, and we saw 2 metabolites associated with increased air pollution exposure, those being myoinositol and glutathione. And when we look at the relationship between those metabolite levels and our anxiety, we saw myoinositol being strongly associated with increased levels of anxiety at age 12. And when we put it into a mediation analysis, we come up with about 20% is our estimate of the direct relationship between air pollution exposure and the anxiety outcomes that we saw being mediated through this increased level of myoinositol in the brain. So turning our attention a little bit now, everything I showed you was from the CAPS study to this point in chronic exposure, so long-term average air pollution exposures. This is an analysis we did with a case crossover study with emergency department visits at our institution at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And what we're seeing here is significantly increased PM 2.5 in the days prior to emergency department visits, particularly with mood disorders, adjustment disorders, externalizing disorders, and suicidality. And then considering the neighborhoods in which they live, looking at effect modification and seeing that kids who live in communities with higher deprivation the effect of air pollution exposure is elevated for outcomes like suicidality and anxiety, and actually reduced for adjustment disorders. So with that, I'll stop. I'm looking forward to a great session, and the other speakers are going to delve into a little bit of this. I want to acknowledge my collaborators and point out that I like this infographic that I found online from UK that actually is talking about cleaning up air because of mental health outcomes. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Monica Guschens. Monica is a medical doctor specialized in preventive medicine and public health. She's also a research professor at IS Global in Barcelona. Her research focuses on the role of environmental factors in children's development, in particular brain development, and she received the AGI Walter Rosenblith Award in 2016. And well, childhood brain development and air pollution will be the topic of her talk, and she will talk about especially the evidence from brain imaging studies. Monica, the floor is yours. Let me see whether I can pull up the slides here. Oh, yeah, here. I see it, my name. Yes. Good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks to you. Okay, put it like this, otherwise I don't see you. I think I can. Good. Then thank you very much for the introduction. My talk is going to be mainly on what do we know on air pollution and brain development, going into population neuroimaging, also because it's mainly the most novel part of this research. Then, as has already been introduced in the previous talk, from conception until early adulthood, there is a lot of development of the brain, which different phases are occurring. And I would like to quote Professor Philip Granger that once said in his book, you only have one chance to develop a brain. It has been shown that if you have been exposed to some environmental insults in some specific timing, maybe the brain cannot recover. Then that's why it's very important to study environmental exposures to this, and in particular air pollution. I always like to start with this study, which actually was the first one showing some evidence on the potential effects of air pollution in the brain. That was a very simple design. In Mexico, they took 30 children from Mexico City, as you can imagine, highly exposed to air pollution, 30 children from a rural area from Mexico, very low air pollution. They also took children, their dogs, when they died, and they did the autopsy, and they found these lesions on the white matter for those that were more exposed to air pollution, both in the children and the dogs. Then this was, I think, one of the first ones that helped going more into this topic. Then the brain. We have been listening also in the previous talk. In the coming ones, we will talk about cognitive development, mental health, how children are developing in our society and interacting with the rest, and how they are taking decisions. But something that is also very interesting is to see what's going on in the brain. Then how we can study this in our epidemiological studies. We do this magnetic brain imaging scans. It's quite easy when they are very young. They're just sleeping in the scan. And after 6, 7, it's getting easier, I would say. It's not easy because they really need to keep still. Otherwise, you cannot use the data. Then that's most of the studies are done after 6 years or in the first year of life. Then we can study a lot of things, but mostly studies have been looking. I grouped this in macrostructure of the brain, the morphology, how is the structures of the brain, macrostructure, microstructure, I will explain a bit better later, and the function, how the brain, how it's connecting, how the different areas of the brain are connecting. Then how do we do with brain macrostructure, that is the morphology? We can look at the different parts of the brain, the volumes, how big they are, I have not put it, but the brain from conception until early adulthood is developing, and it has different pathways on how the brain, some areas are growing faster, some are growing slower at different paces. Then to study how these brain volumes at different ages might give us an insight on what's going on in the brain. We can also look at the different structures, and we can also look at cortical thickness and surface area. The cortex is the outer layer of the brain, and we can see how thick it is. This is related to the pruning and how the neurons is developing during all the childhood and adolescence. Then it's not meant to be a systematic review. I think I might miss a couple of the last paper was published soon. But it's quite a good overview has been ever published on the topic. Then if we go to brain morphology, there has been 12 publications which are based on 7 studies. It's not that we have 12 studies, mostly in the US, 4, and then 3 in Europe. And exposure has been more or less half, studying pregnancy exposure or childhood exposure. I try to make an overview here just to see the complexity. I only summarize brain volumes and cortical thickness in this table, and we have pregnancy and childhood exposure. We can see for the brain volumes, we can see for some volumes, we see an increase. Air pollution has been related to increase brain volume in certain ages or a decrease in others. This makes sense because some structures are supposed at some time points to increase or decrease. The funny thing is that this is not consistent between studies. Then we need to explore, there is very few studies, as you can see. And also with the cortical thickness is the same mixed results. I will just pull, I will not, there is no time to go through all the papers. I will just pull a few things I would like to explain. For example, in the first figure on the top is just a summary of the study on this. They scan children just a few days after birth. And then, for example, I would like to say they saw that air pollution was associated with a reduction of the hippocampus volume. And this in our Dutch cohort, that is the figure at the bottom, we also saw at early pre-adolescence that air pollution was related to this reduction of the hippocampus volume is the red line in the figure compared to the dot green line. But the curious thing is when we follow these children longitudinally and we assess again when they were in average 14 years old, we don't see anymore this association. Then it could be that air pollution might affect some areas of the brain, but the brain is so plastic that it may be able to recover. This could be one hypothesis, the only few studies about that, but this is something it could be nice to explore further. When we go into the cortical thickness, you can see it's a mess. I mean, everybody finds a different part of the brain, some associated to a higher, air pollution is related to a higher cortical thickness, others to a lower, depending on the pollutant, depending on the study. Then there is still a lot of work to do here to try to understand what's really going on in it. But there are several studies. I mean, all the studies that they published, they found a lot of findings. When we go to the microstructure, we want to see more in detail how the cells are functioning. And we can have like, here I put an example of the white matter. We have different techniques because also the imaging techniques have been improving. Then some things we have been collecting data a few years ago, we cannot check. But some other studies, like the figure at the bottom, they are really checking more in detail. Then this is more to see the white matter is all the axons that how the different areas of the brain are connecting. And then we can see how the water diffuses and if it's more efficient, and then the communication will be better or not. And this is related to the brain development. When the brain is developing, this diffusion improves, it gets more mature. And then we want to see if air pollution is related to the maturation of this white matter. Now we are reducing papers, 7 publications with only 4 epidemiological studies, 2 in the US and 2 in Europe. And it's mostly childhood exposure that has been explored. And again, not so much consistent results. Some studies are looking at the average of this white matter microstructure of the brain to simplify. Then we have one or two parameters to look, how is this white matter? And other studies, they go very in detail to explore if there are regional effects. Then this is, again, the study we did in the Netherlands that we have longitudinal data. Depending on the matrix like that has been explored, I will not be in detail, but is a proxy of how this white matter is maturing. We can see that air pollution affects this white matter maturation across the entire preschool, pre-adolescent ages, let's say, from 10 until adolescence 14. But for another parameter we look, it seems also this kind of a catch-up that it was affected at the early pre-adolescence, but in adolescence, this is not anymore the case. It would be nice to see other studies and to see the consistency also of these findings. And then this, I just present another study here in the US where they look at different patterns, different regional. The colors means different associations. This means like depending on the pollutant and depending on the region, you find something different. This raises the questions to me. What does it mean? Why PM 2.5 should have an effect in one area and NO2 in the same area, another different effect? I think I don't have the answer. It's just something I want to put here on the table. I think this is very new research, then still a lot needs to be done. And the last part, which I found also very interesting, is the function. I mean, we can find structural changes, but how is the brain functioning? This is a study. The child is around 6 minutes for this technique in the machine. You instruct the child not to think about anything special, just relax, not getting asleep, and be quiet. And then we see how the brains in a resting state, that is called, are connecting. Which is the communication, the normal communication of the brain. Then you can see, there is the technique, and then the brain, it's defined in different networks, it's called. Depending on the author, there are different networks. But I present this one, and then you want to see how the connection is within a network or between networks. With the development, when the brain develops, we need to reduce the within network, and we are increasing the between. That is, it's very generally speaking, because it depends on the region, but this is more or less what we would expect. Then again, fewer research on that. Every time the techniques are a bit more difficult to proceed, and 5 papers. Now we are dropping to 3 studies, one in the US, one in the Netherlands, and one in Spain. And then mostly also in childhood. And for some studies, they found mostly a lower connectivity, which we would expect that's a less mature brain. But some other studies, they found a mix between higher connectivity and lower connectivity. I just put also here one example to go through it, which they found a different effect depending if it's PM 2.5 or NO2 for exactly the connection from the same 2 networks on the same children. Then on the left, we have that higher exposed to PM 2.5, it's an increased connectivity between these 2 networks, is the dot lines go up. But for NO2, the square on the right, the left graph, it's higher NO2 is a decreased connectivity between exactly these 2 networks. Then it's something that also needs to be explored, why 2 air pollutants could have differential effects on the same regions. Then what does it mean? What happens with these children? We find these different structures that we are assuming is immature brain, but how they function in the daily life. Do we see any clinical or any functional implication? Very few studies, maybe I have missed one, but this I really look, I thought a lot of studies, they don't find any clinical implication. And I found this too, that this is actually one of the first studies that they published. They found air pollution was related to a reduction of the white matter surface. And then they found that this was also mediated and was related to an impair on a cognitive test that the children were doing, how they process information. Theoretically, when we mature, we are able to process the information faster. Like if someone asks me a question, I can look for the information faster and I can answer. This is what we are when we are maturing. Then they actually found this very nice mediation. Air pollution was related to this reduction of the white matter, and this was related to an impairment of this processing speed. This beautiful. Another replication, which was my first paper on this air pollution and imaging, we also found in the Dutch cohort, higher PM2.5 exposure was related to a poorer inhibitory control. It was a test that children need to control their impulses. This is very important for our daily life, to decide and to control what we need to inhibit or not, especially in adolescents. Then we also found the mediation, this reduction of cortical thickness in few areas that were also related to this poorer inhibitory control. And then they were mediating the association between air pollution and this. This has been beautiful, 2 studies. Maybe, and now I will go to the conclusions, but probably it's very difficult to find also this connection. Then I kept it brief because, yeah, there's just few things of few studies. We can discuss about the rest of the studies if you want, but I would just say air pollution has really been associated with several brain structural and functional changes from infancy to adolescence. That's true. We have seen a lot of these fewer studies that I present. But there are different results depending on the study, but even within the same study, depending on the air pollutant that has been assessed. Then I think there is a lot of work still to understand what's going on. And little is known about potential functional implications. It could be that these changes that we see, of this immaturity of the brain, we will see later in life some functional, and maybe now it's too early still to see something. This is possible, of course. Then challenges, I think that's very important. I think most of the findings are with very few. That's what I wanted to point out. There is just these few studies in the US and these few in Europe, and with varying sample sizes. The big one in the US is 10,000 and is repeated. It's very nice. The one I've been working in the Netherlands is 4,000 and is repeated. It's very nice. The rest is less than 200, 300, 400. Then it's very small samples. I'm wondering if we have publication bias, because all the papers show something, there is little, then maybe people are looking, they don't find anything, and then they don't publish. Then maybe we are missing part of the story to understand also these different findings, or they found something that they think is unexpected and they don't publish. But I think it should be published to try to understand the full picture. The outcome measures and analytical approach is not harmonized, and it's different techniques, and it's very difficult also to compare. It's a very complex outcome measure. I try to kind of summarize it, but it's very complex and it's not well understood. Even neuroscientists still are wondering different connections of the brain, what is actually meaning. Then still we need to work very closely with neuroscientists to understand better this. And all the studies, as you can see, is from the global north with relatively low levels of air pollution. And I think we are missing a huge part of the picture here too. Opportunities, I think that's very interesting. Even still mixed results to understand the biological mechanisms beyond the cognitive function and the mental health. I think that's very important to understand better what's going on. Longitudinal, well, I was asking for more studies, but if we even have longitudinal data, that's even better. It would be very nice to make an effort to harmonize and to try to understand, now that we have already all these studies, like to try to compile all the data and see if we can make something more robust out of it. As has been pointed out also from the previous talk, to consider other environmental exposures. And actually I'm working on child development, but there is more research on imaging and population neuroimaging in adults than in children. And it would be very nice to also combine and to try to understand what's going on the other side of the life, let's say, after 30, 40s, and how we can combine the cognitive development with the cognitive decline and also with the imaging studies. I think the life course is missing also this big picture, not to work separately. And that's all. Thank you very much.
So I'll go ahead and invite our next speaker up, Dr. Aaron Rubin, who is an assistant professor of neuropsychology and environmental health at the University of Virginia. His lab investigates the interplay of the physical environment with brain health across the lifespan. Aaron holds a PhD in clinical psychology from Duke University and a master's in environmental management from Yale University. He is also the 2023 recipient of the Corselli Prize of the Proceedings of the United States National Academy of Sciences for his work on legacy neurotoxins. His work will be covering the span of environmental contextual factors and mental health. Welcome.
So I was asked to provide some more information on the context around air pollution mental health studies. I'm going to give myself a second task now, which is to wake us all back up after this delay and all the barbecue we ate. I had a lot of nice animations. You'll just have to imagine them. Okay, so let's just click. I'm going to click on this. Let's see, will it toggle for me? Okay, good enough. All right, so I'm going to do two things. I'm going to back up and give us a really quick primer on mental health in general, because a lot of us aren't psychologists, and we've been learning a lot in psychology over the last decade or two that I think is useful for us thinking about air pollution in this setting. Oh, now I have some technical assistance, maybe. I'll stand like this. Is that okay at the back? All right. Oh. Well, I'll tell you the second thing I'm going to do. So first we'll do, oh, that looks good. Oh, that looks perfect. I don't know what you did, but you did it. This is great. Okay, gorgeous. All right, yes. That's great. All right, so second thing I'll do, and I'll try to do it quickly, is then contextualize air pollution mental health findings in light of what I'm going to tell you about what we've learned in psychology. So let's do this quickly. We're going to do a short primer on mental health, because we like to talk about mental health a lot, but it's actually more complicated when we think of it. And we often talk about it as a binary condition. You either have good mental health or you don't. You either have a diagnosis or you don't. Reality is, this is not the right way to think of mental illness. Our mental health is far more intricate and dynamic than that. And at any given moment, our mental health is actually the sum of our thoughts, feelings, and experiences, and the general control we have over our actions in the world. So here I've listed out some of the dynamic poles on which we can think of our experience and behaviors operating. Some things like emotional valence. How do I feel right now? Do I feel good? Do I feel bad? Our physiological arousal. We just ate barbecue. Are we awake? Are we sleepy? Our sensitivity to stimulus, light, sound, social cues. Our ability to control or direct our impulses to achieve our goals. Our ability to track and regulate our thoughts in real time. There are many, many more facets of human experience that I could have listed here that are relevant to how we think, feel, and behave at any moment. Let's take an example. Someone experiencing low positive emotional valence, low physiological arousal, low stimulus sensitivity, often enough and long enough would likely meet DSM criteria for a depressive disorder diagnosis. They might benefit from treatment. Someone else experiencing high positive emotional valence, high physiological arousal, and low impulse control might be experiencing a transient manic episode. If I had more time, I would do a little call and response and have you guess. My general point is, when you are operating in the world, there are probably 20 to 30 poles of experience that are dynamically experienced at any moment. Whether or not you reach criteria for a clinical diagnosis is really just about the severity of those poles. Generally speaking, we see problems in thinking and behaving along those poles. tending to cluster together into domains that we call externalizing, internalizing, and thought disorder, as well as a higher order liability to all problems that we call general psychopathology, which really captures your liability to problems across all of those domains. So these categories map onto diagnosable disorders, which tend to be highly comorbid and have overlapping diagnostic symptoms. Externalizing conditions express problems outward. So things like disordered substance use, interactions with others, disordered ability to regulate our behavior. Internalizing expresses problems inward. Things like withdrawal, loss of pleasure, fear, worry. And then thought disorder reflects disordered sensing, perceiving, and interpreting the world, as well as regulation of the body. And that's where we see things like OCD, mania, and psychosis. And while it's true that broad classes of disorders tend to show different timelines of emergence, this is meta-analysis results for when you will tend to see the first emergence of a particular class of disorder. We do see differences disorder to disorder. Anxiety disorders show up first, as Patrick very nicely showed us. Psychosis tends to show up last. As Monica showed us, that tends to reflect later pruning of the brain being disordered. But most problems generally emerge, as you can see, in early life, but really mid to late adolescence. But it's more complicated than that. If you follow people closely over time, these disorders don't stay true. People move in and out of diagnostic categories of distress. So this chart I'm showing you now, it shows mental health trajectories for members of a birth cohort that I work with in New Zealand that's been assessed repeatedly across the first half of their lifespan. And these folks are now 52, and we're in the middle of our 15th assessment wave. At each year of assessment, which is listed on the bottom, we see the portion of people with no disorder, they're in green, internalizing disorder, and externalizing disorder, and so on. And every line on this graph is a person. The people who stay green across the whole chart never once meet criteria for a disorder. But what I hope you can see is that roughly 40% of people start to develop some disorder symptoms early on by age 11, and then move in and out of diagnostic categories, sometimes for internalizing, sometimes externalizing, often for more than one. Sometimes people get worse, sometimes people get better. The people who get better, incidentally, they enter that light green phase. That's the folks who have a remitted disorder that don't go on to have another disorder. In general, when we follow 1,000 people like this, we end up seeing something on the order of 600 unique mental health trajectories. So what can account for this pattern of changing problems over time? When we say that mental health reflects our status on any number of poles of function and experience, it's not controversial to say that our baselines, ranges, and movement on those poles arise from the interplay of our genes and our dynamic environments. So someone like this, with the restricted poles and movement on more of the internalizing end, we might label an anxious avoidant type person. They might be more fearful more often than others. They might be unlikely to form healthy relationships. Maybe they struggle in social situations. They can move up and down on their poles, but they might just be set a little more anxiously than the average person. And we tend to say that stressors, anything that challenges our equilibrium, and resilience factors, anything that keeps us even, together determine when and if we have an emotional behavioral problem that meets clinical criteria or that might require treatment. So in this case, you can be pushed into a clinical range that's kind of above the stressor line, where orange would show you've got symptoms of a problem. You can be pushed and pulled back by resilience factors, and you can start to see how people may have problems at one time point that resolve as things get better. Maybe they're going through a divorce. Maybe the divorce resolves. Maybe they just finished a final exam like my students will tomorrow. All right, so that was the brief primer. I think I got through it faster than I had intended. So we might be back on track. Now I want to contextualize what we're finding with air pollution in terms of all these other things that we've talked about. How can environmental stressors transiently or lastingly change mental health? Well, between our genes, our social and physical environment, we've got this dynamic interplay of factors pushing us towards worse function on those poles and then pulling us back towards better function. And the list of actors in our social environment, it's almost infinite, right? Parents, siblings, neighbors, teachers, economic and cultural institutions, new administrations. Some increase our liability to mental distress, say by invalidating our emotions or threatening our safety. Others will diminish our risk by offering comfort or direction. Similarly, the list of physical environmental characteristics that can operate on us are limitless. Here are just a few I came up with. You can probably think of many more. Many of these are known to stress the nervous system or alter our set points on those many poles of experience. And the same stimulus, be it a rainstorm or a passing commuter train, will have a different effect on every individual based on their current set points and their goals at that moment. And you can easily see how the same event can terrify or exhilarate based on our preparation for it or our interpretation of it. So we end up in this research seeing environment by environment interactions, environment by personality interactions, environment by preparation interactions, and environment by gene interactions. So I'd now like you to consider how these various factors coexist and intermingle with time and space. So here's a map from an area I work in regularly, the city of Dunedin in New Zealand, where we followed that complete birth cohort that I told you about now for our 15th assessment in the fifth decade of life. And my colleagues at the University of Canterbury have made a searchable map that aggregates what they call environmental goods and environmental bads, with darker colors indicating a more disadvantageous ratio of goods to bads. What you will quickly see is there are areas of this town, I should say city, where higher density of bads, things like alcohol outlets and gambling venues, coexist with lower access to goods, things like recreation facilities and grocery stores. All of us in this room already know that when you layer on information about environmental contaminants, you find that these parts of town that are already socially disadvantaged also have higher levels of air, water, and soil contaminants. In this map, I'm showing you soil lead levels, which were deposited from painted buildings shedding particles, but more likely, primarily deposition from vehicle exhaust over the past century of lead's use in petrofuels. And we now know that lead is a potent neurotoxin. Naturally, these areas of town tend to be where people with the least means live, which means their mix of occupational and educational opportunities and outcomes is also fundamentally different, sometimes block to block. And it all makes our job as epidemiologists rich and extremely challenging. And that doesn't yet take into account our internal environment, which is forever interacting with this external environment, shaping and being shaped by it. So from our microbes and hormones to the medications we're taking and the epigenetic regulation of our gene expressions, all of this is happening in the same time and space. So what do we do with this? I didn't have a good answer when I was asked to give this talk, but I sat down to think about how I'm approaching the question. And I think my mantra now is let's just embrace the complexity. We've got the means. We talked about AI. We're gathering new forms of data set. I guess if I want you to take anything away, it's that if you're going to be working in mental health, let's embrace complexity as much with this as you may have with your air pollution models. I think we should be measuring multiple pollutants. You're already doing that. But we should also be measuring multiple psychiatric symptoms. Why? Well, the depressed child won't stay depressed, but they might have a thought disorder later. And that anxious adult may have had untreated ADHD. We should also be measuring multiple time points and ages for the very same reason. And then multiple contextual factors, which we know heavily correlate with those other conditions. So let's look at some real data. That's a lot more fun than conjecture. What does it look like in practice? So in my work, we've only begun to scratch the surface, but we're starting and trying to layer in more and more complex assessments of function and environment. So I'll tell you about one study, a birth cohort of twins that we've been following since the mid-90s, the Environmental Risk Longitudinal Twin Study. This is a twin cohort of just over 2,200 kids who were recruited across England and Wales, but with specific enrichment recruitment for so-called high-risk families who might be living in less affluent neighborhoods. And in the end, because of that enriched recruitment, we have almost perfectly equal numbers of families in our study across different demographic rankings of neighborhoods in the UK. So we see equal number of participants from the most, least, and then middle deprived neighborhoods. So in seeking to understand better the interplay of environments with mental health, we've conducted a series of multimodal measurements targeting different neighborhood characteristics. So we've been using government data, neighborhood resident surveys, research worker observations via Google Street View walkthroughs, where they'll actually walk past everyone's homes, coding the neighborhood for things they see. And with all of that information, we've ranked each family's neighborhood on characteristics of socioeconomic deprivation, physical dilapidation, so things like unclean graffiti, vacant buildings, trash not being cleared away, social disconnection, things like neighbors saying they can't trust each other, people saying this is an active community or not, and then dangerousness in terms of things like crime and safety, both from residents' subjective perspective and from official crime statistics. And we're able to examine these 4 neighborhood characteristics separately or thrown all together into what we would call a comprehensive ecological risk index. The first thing we find when we do these assessments, not surprisingly, is that these characteristics are highly correlated. So from a correlation statistic of around 0.4 to around 0.7 between each of these characteristics, which is extremely high. And that is what I would call concentrated holistic disadvantage. And this, by the way, is in a country with a pretty robust social safety net, where if anything, you might expect or imagine you might see less concentrated disadvantage. So this is a panel on air pollution. You'll want to know, did you measure air pollution? And we did. We measured a few things, but I'll tell you about NOx and PM 2.5 here. We used monitoring station information and dynamic modeling. We were able to generate pretty fine resolution estimates down to the street level, linked to the study members' homes at ages 9, 10, and then 17 and 18. Here's our map showing sort of average NOx concentrations, as well as the sort of dynamic modeling over time. We see, of course, enrichment along roadways and urban areas. Oh, and now you can't see, I had a scatter plot here showing the NOx levels by different neighborhood characteristics. What is left is the trend line. So you can imagine the dots that you would have seen. The point here is that we see air pollution levels scale almost 1-to-1 with disadvantage, deprivation, dilapidation, disconnection, really any neighborhood characteristic we've ranked. As that characteristic gets worse, air pollution levels get worse as well. So this is NOx, and then this is PM 2.5. Again, for some reason, you can't see the dots, but we're seeing quite consistent, quite large, I would say, correlations. One thing this tells us is if we're not able to take into account some of these neighborhood factors, our air pollution study effects may have a lot of unmeasured residual confounding. And again, these aren't insignificant correlations. So in this study, we also measured multiple mental health domains, looking at symptoms not just of 1 or 2 disorders, but multiple disorders at once using gold standard clinical interviews. And doing that allows us to create continuous holistic symptom factor scores for those clusters that I told you about, as well as someone's overall liability to mental illness. And this allows us to ask, do children raised among higher levels of ambient air pollution display overall differences in mental illness symptoms by age 18 at the transition to adulthood? And the answer is yes, they do. We tested this continuously, but to make it nice for a figure, I'm showing you separately for NOx and PM 2.5, average mental illness symptomatology scores for kids living in the top quartile of NOx and PM 2.5 exposure compared to the bottom 3 quartiles. The scale we chose matches IQ scales. So the mean is 100, standard deviation is 15. So what does that mean? Well, we see higher symptoms in kids living in these more air polluted areas, but they're not big effects. These are small effects that we would think might be only meaningful once you scale across the city, across a state or country. But I hope you're asking now, well, isn't air pollution worse in the neighborhoods with more crime, where people tell you that they know their neighbors less, where there's more signs of physical decay? Because we measured them, we can adjust for these correlated factors in our models. Here you can see the statistical effects separately on internalizing, externalizing, and thought disorder. It's probably hard to read, but we're just adjusting for each of these different conditions in our models. And what you can see is the association of, in this case, NOx with our different mental health symptoms. It remains robust to those adjustments, which makes us confident that not necessarily are we seeing a causal effect here, but that at least it isn't accounted for by these correlated neighborhood conditions. And we've only begun to scratch the surface of the complexity. We'd really like to now consider how these factors might interact together to synergistically elevate risk of mental health problems or foster psychiatric disorder. But I think I'm close to out of time. But I do want to tell you one more thing that I'd like us to embrace, which is genetic effects. So in the same neighborhoods, in a separate study, we created polygenic risk scores for a variety of behaviors that are known to be more likely in disadvantageous neighborhoods. And what we find is as neighborhood conditions get worse, and this is our sort of overall ecological risk, genetic propensities for disadvantageous behaviors increase alongside those, increase alongside that neighborhood disadvantage. So in this case, on the left, I'm showing actual rates of obesity, teen pregnancy, poor educational outcomes, unemployment. You see that it scales with neighborhood conditions. But on the right is polygenic risk, which for everything except obesity also scales. So what we're seeing is likely some kind of selection effects where folks who, for example, have a higher risk for mental illness due to genetic precondition are in more disadvantaged neighborhoods more often. And we don't know, is that an intergenerational effect? Is it happening over time? We need to embrace that complexity in our studies. We're also seeing epigenetic differences. So we know there's more tobacco smoking. We know there's more obesity. We know there's higher inflammation among folks living in disadvantaged neighborhoods. When we do epigenome-wide association studies or polyepigenetic studies using epigenetic scores, we find higher DNA methylation of genes linked to smoking and inflammation, even if we take into account people's behaviors. And we see that those genes are often enriched for air pollutants as well. So I just want to end by trying to answer one question, which is, why is air pollution robustly associated with global elevation in psychiatric symptoms over and above conditions in the neighborhood? We've talked about some brain imaging. We've talked about developmental changes. I would like to propose that what you are seeing is the longer term effects of what you might call a disordered brain, a brain that has less control over the movement on those poles, weaker thought control, weaker impulse inhibition, weaker emotion regulation. And that in theory is a consequence of poor neurodevelopment. All right, I'll just thank our many collaborators and sponsors, and I will get off the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with this, I would like to introduce our last speaker of this session, Aisha Dickerson. She's an environmental neuroepidemiologist with research interests in environmental risk factors in neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative disorders. She studies joint environmental occupational exposures, psychosocial stresses, and subsequent individual and transgenerational neurological outcomes. She's working at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and completed postdoctoral trainings at the EPA and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And she will talk about child and adolescent neurodevelopment and environmental health disparities. Please, the floor is yours.
And I'm going to start my timer. Here we go. Anybody familiar with this gentleman named Marvin Gaye? Hey, all right. He wrote this song decades ago, before I was even born, conceived, or thought of. That was all about how, one, the world is just in decline, but two, it had a little verse about how pollution is also destroying the environment, but more so in lower income communities. So this isn't some new topic. This is something that Marvin Gaye was talking about a long, long time ago. Let's see if we can get this to work. Here we go. All right, great. So we're talking about neurodevelopment, child and adolescent outcomes. And as environmental epidemiologists, we always think, well, what is the primary window of exposure? When we're thinking about kids, is it prenatal exposures or is it infancy, especially when we're looking at adolescent outcomes, or is it early childhood? The fact is we really don't know, which is why we've been trying to get a better grip on what is the most impactful window of exposure for a variety of neurodevelopmental outcomes. What we do hypothesize, though, is that through these exposures, in this case to the mother, there might be some kind of an influence on oxidative stress and cellular damage, both in the mother and in the child, or it could be inflammation, but what is the specific symptom or system that is having the biggest impact on neurodevelopment? We don't know. There's also this thing, and when I was in school, epigenetics was a new thing. It's not so much now. But the fact is we don't know, out of all of these hypothesized mechanisms, what really causes the neurodevelopmental outcomes in the child. But for the most part, people think, well, the mother's exposed to all these toxins or some environmental exposure, and it might go through the blood and cross the placenta and right across the blood-brain barrier, and boom, that impacts the child's brain. So a lot of people have been focusing their attention on infancy and the third trimester of pregnancy, with the thought that there's this, as we mentioned in a previous presentation, this pruning and development of the neurons in the brain as the child is growing. Everybody blames everything on the mother, but guess what? You got to stop doing that. It's not just the mothers, it's the fathers too. Because yeah, the mother could be exposed to some things, but the fathers are also exposed to a lot of toxicants, which could lead to male-mediated teratogenesis. So it's not just the eggs that the mother's carrying, but it takes sperm that interact with that egg to make a child, right? So I say it's not just what the mother is exposed to, not just the air pollution and the toxins, but also what the father's exposed to that leads to outcomes in the children. Now then that leads us to another problem. Well, people who experience discrimination for whatever minoritized characteristic they have, whether that be a lower education, which leads to a lower income, or some kind of a physical characteristic, because they experience that discrimination, it leads to disparities. Again, whether that be through income or underemployment or unemployment, educational gaps, all of those disparities will in turn lead to environmental exposures, but also psychosocial stressors. Now, as our previous speaker just mentioned, we also have this genetic susceptibility, which he measured through polygenic risk. All of those things combined, depending on the window of exposure, could potentially lead to a variety of neurodevelopmental outcomes, including autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and intellectual disability. So for the past few years, I've been investigating air pollution because we know there's a biologically plausible risk factor for neurodevelopmental disorders in children. But what we've also found in our research is that community level disadvantage is also associated with a disproportionate burden of environmental exposures in mothers, fathers, and children. So the question is, do those things work together to potentially lead to neurodevelopmental outcomes in children? Usually people think about these clinical outcomes like, again, autism, ADHD, intellectual disability, speech delay, things that we can measure in the clinic or at the child visits, but also in the school system. But then there's this thing called sacrifice zones. So we spoke a little bit about this overburden of exposures in these lower income communities. First of all, let me ask this. Who has heard of a sacrifice zone? Yay. So when I speak about this in other countries, oftentimes they haven't heard of a sacrifice zone. So let me tell you all about it. In certain communities, again, often housing minoritized populations, lower income communities, they become these dumping grounds, which means that once one industry sets up, they say, oh, that was easy. Let me tell my friends how to do it. Everybody can set up all of their industries close to this community. Once those industries move in and around the communities, what they experience is this disinvestment and impairment, not only in the community, but the environment around the community. Well, you say, how did that happen? How could people just let somebody set up industries in their community? Well, back in the 1930s, there's this thing called redlining. Anybody ever heard of redlining? Hey, all right. So what happened with redlining is all of these banks would give people loans to purchase homes. They had let's see if I can get my mouse to work. No, well, just the red areas were the less, they're the riskier areas, let's say that. Well, what did they mean by risk? Anybody want to guess? Non-white. So risky meant non-white, unfortunately. Yellow meant, not as risky as the red areas, but we're getting close. And then blue was like, these are the areas you need to come to. Well, this is Baltimore because I live in Baltimore now because I work at Johns Hopkins. And the fact is that decades later, yeah, Baltimore has changed a lot, but we still have a little bit of segregation. And in Baltimore, the areas where we have a predominantly non-white population are also the areas with more lead-based paint. There are also the areas with more air pollution, industrial facilities, waste incinerators. All of those things are lumped into these areas together. So those are the sacrifice zones. And you say, well, that's Baltimore. It's just, that's how Baltimore is. No, it's not just Baltimore. This happened all over the United States, including in Texas. So here is Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas is an easy one to pick out because they also have these oil rigs and things around there. But since we're in Austin, I thought, hey, let's look at Austin, right? And usually I would pull maps from the EJ screen, but guess what happened to EJ screen? It disappeared. It's not there anymore. But thankfully, Austin has done a pretty good job of publishing these things on their local health department website. So here we have the redlining map from Austin, Texas. You see the red areas, which again are the risky areas, which again are the non-white areas. Those areas, back in the 1930s, I don't know why I think you all can see. Oh, there we go. Oh, there's the mouse. Okay, so these areas that were non-white in the 1930s are still predominantly non-white now. Isn't that fun? And thankfully they had this little map here. So even though I couldn't pull up EJ screen anymore, they had a map of areas that they called EJ areas, which in this case would be like the sacrifice zones. So these areas are still concentrated in Austin, Texas. Now let's see if I can get the slides to move. Okay, good. I was scared they wouldn't move. So this is not, again, just, I say this now because I did an interview with somebody from England one time and they say environmental justice is a big issue in the South, right? I guess, because he was British. And I'm like, no, this isn't just a Southern thing. It's an all over the United States thing, not just in Alabama where I'm from, but in Baltimore where I live now, but also all over the world. The issue with environmental justice issues is that even if we clean up an area, let me look at my clock. Okay, we're good. Even if we clean up all of these environmental hazards, a lot of these toxicants, including those that we're exposed to via the air, can store in the body. So lipophilic proteins can store in the fat. And then we have these bone storing toxins. Anybody know what's the biggest toxicant that stores in the bone? Lead, that's right. So both bone and fat can metabolize during a few different stages in life, but one of the big stages in life where bone and fat metabolize is during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. Ooh. So it's not just what a mother is exposed to during pregnancy or even what the child is exposed to during infancy that matters. It's what a mother is exposed to over her lifetime that can store, metabolize, and then remobilize and expose the child. So now we're going into air pollution. So years ago, I did this study with the CDC using the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network data, which is publicly available, though it did take me 2 years to get access to the data. I was able to get data from Maryland, Arizona, South Carolina, Utah, and New Jersey. Again, even though it was publicly available, I asked for it at the individual level, but they were giving it to me at an aggregate level because they were concerned about me identifying the participants. These were children who would have received an autism diagnosis or a school designation by the age of 8 years of age. I linked their census tract data to the EPA's toxic release inventory data, which also used to be publicly available and is no longer. At least I couldn't find it on the EPA site. Is it back up? Do you know? Right, yeah, so they're legally required to report it. It was publicly available, so I was able to link that data to the census tract centroids for the kids who were in the ADAM data. And what I found was that for the areas that were within the closest 40th percentile of proximity to industrial facilities, autism prevalence increased. That was in the unadjusted analysis. But even when I adjusted for a few socio-demographic characteristics at the census tract level, we found that within the closest 10th percentile of proximity to industrial facilities, autism prevalence was higher in those census tracts. That was a long time ago. That was aggregated data. And now that I no longer have studies funded by Aisha Dickerson LLC, we can now get some funding to do this on the individual level. And we've been working on trying to replicate this in a better way using the early and the marbles data. So these are 2 cohort studies. For early, we get kids from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Northern California, whereas with marbles, we get kids from Northern California. We follow them over time. We have a lot of biological samples from the mothers, but we also have their residential history, not just during pregnancy, but prior to pregnancy. And so we've been using these repeated measures and a distributed lag model to try to pick out the most important window of exposure for air pollution and autism spectrum disorder in the offspring, but also autism symptomology using the SRS. So this is a study that hasn't been published yet, so you can take a picture of this slide if you want to, but you can't share it with anybody, okay? Because this is from Ashley Song, and I promised her that I would tell you all not to show it to anybody because we really want to get this published soon, but I'll tell you about it. So with this distributed lag model, what I want to, what's really, really important, let's see if I can point this out over here, is that we stratify by low deprivation, moderate deprivation, and high deprivation. So high deprivation would be those more disadvantaged communities, and the low deprivation would be the more affluent communities. And again, we're looking at air pollution exposures, primarily PM10 and PM2.5. We have some other data that aren't up here. What we found is that air pollution was only associated with autism and autism symptomology in the areas that had low deprivation or the more affluent areas, but not so much apparent in the highly deprived neighborhoods. A lot of people say, well, we know that air pollution leads to these neurocognitive disorders, right? That doesn't make sense. But as we mentioned earlier, people who live in these areas with a lot of air pollution also have a lot of other exposures. So the lead-based paint, they have food deserts, they have psychosocial stressors. It's quite possible that with all of these things compounding on top of each other, when we're looking for some kind of a signal, air pollution is just at the bottom of the list in the multitude of risk factors that somebody in these neighborhoods might experience. So how do we handle that? One thing we're trying to move away from in environmental epidemiology is this one-to-one exposure disease association. As a few of the speakers today have mentioned, we have to start focusing on mixed exposures. So what we're doing with early in marbles is using quantile G computation. Oh, that sounds fancy. To not just stack environmental exposures, but also psychosocial stressors as compounding exposures. With quantile G computation, hopefully we can get a better grip on, out of this multitude of exposures that a mother or a child might experience, which one has the greatest weight on the risk of a health outcome, in this case, neurodevelopmental disorders. On top of that, we also have to point out that we can't just focus on these clinical outcomes, because oftentimes kids from lower income communities and marginalized populations are less likely to get that clinical diagnosis. So this is a paper that I published earlier this year with Kristen Lau from Drexel that showed that in kids from minoritized populations, especially Black children, even if they had an SRS score that showed that they should have had an autism diagnosis, they were less likely to actually have an autism diagnosis. So the SRS score suggests that, yes, they have autism, but they didn't actually have that diagnosis. So we can't just focus on clinical outcomes, but we also have to look at subclinical outcomes, including behavioral problems, learning deficits, and things of that nature. The last point I want to make is that as public health practitioners, oftentimes we go to people and we say, you need to eat better. Ignore the fact that you live in a food desert. You need to avoid lead-based paint. Ignore the fact that your landlord didn't do any lead remediation. You need to meditate to handle your stress. Ignore the fact that you're having trouble getting a job. People live within households, and households are within communities. So we can't just focus on individual interventions, but we also have to focus on community level interventions to look at cumulative risk, all right? So I know we're running short on time, so I'm okay with cutting this short and acknowledging all of my homies. Ashley Song, who let me show you all her upcoming results from the study, Heather Volk, Kristen Lau, and my collaborators, Chris Ladacosta, all are members of the Wendy Clagg Center for Autism and Developmental Disabilities. So thank you all for listening to me today. I hope I got you to get a little bit of a giggle in before we have our ice cream party. So I'll step down, or do I need to stay up here for the, okay. Oh, thank you. Oh, don't touch anything? Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our speakers for the excellent talks. And unfortunately, we are running out of time and don't have time for discussion, but there is this ice cream social break after this session. So I would recommend talking to the speakers, discussing this very interesting, but also very complex topic. And then I hope to see many of you at the posters after the ice cream social break. So let's end with another round of applause.